Welcome to Philosophy and Critical Thinking, the basics. In our last video, we discussed how we use arguments to get knowledge and to give knowledge. In this video, we're going to be discussing what makes arguments valid and what makes arguments invalid. An argument is valid when if all the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. What this means is, if all the reasons or all the premises in the argument are true, then the conclusion would have to be true. There can't be any single circumstance where the premises could all be true, but the conclusion turns out to be false. So this is how we can tell whether an argument is invalid. An invalid argument is even if we take it as a given that all the premises or all the reasons are true, there can be a circumstance where the conclusion could turn out to be false. So, to be valid, if all the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Invalid, even if all the premises are true, the conclusion could be false. Let's test to see whether an argument is valid or invalid by looking at the argument from our first video. The argument was, all humans will eventually die, I am human, therefore I'll eventually die. Let's look at the first two premises here. All humans will eventually die, and I'm human. To say that all humans will eventually die is to say that everything that is a human will eventually die. So if you're a human, you will eventually die. The second premise is confirming that I am a human. So this is a valid argument, because if it's true that all humans will eventually die, it would have to be the case that if you're a human, you'll eventually die. So this is valid. It can't be any other way if those premises are true. If we tried to say that if I was a robot or if I was an angel, it wouldn't be true that I'm human. If I was to say there was some kind of gene or some kind of technology that could make me live forever even though I'm a human, then it wouldn't be true that all humans will eventually die. So this argument is valid because we cannot think of any circumstance where both premises are true, but the conclusion is false. Now let's consider the next argument here. All vampires are skateboards. I am a vampire, therefore I am a skateboard. You'll see quite quickly here that's the same structure as the previous argument, although we've put in some different categories here. So we're saying if you're a vampire, you have to be a skateboard, confirming that I am a vampire, so it has to be the case that I'm a skateboard. Now, if somebody gave you this argument, you'd be quite tempted to question their sanity and see if they needed some help. But the point here is that whether the premises or even the conclusion is true or false is irrelevant when we're testing whether an argument is valid or invalid. So even though quite obviously here both of the premises are false and the conclusion is also false, it's still a valid argument because what it's saying here is that all vampires are skateboards. So it's saying if everything that's a vampire is skateboard, and we're taking that to be true, and if we're confirming that I am a vampire, then it has to be the case I am a skateboard. Just like all humans eventually dying. It's the same logical structure, so it's a valid argument. So just because the premises might be false or the conclusion is false, that is irrelevant when we're testing validity. All we're testing with validity is that if all the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Let's look at this argument here. All humans will eventually die. I'll eventually die. Therefore, I am human. So this is slightly different to the first argument where I was arguing before that I'll eventually die, and now it's being argued that I am human. So the premises are that all humans will eventually die and that I'll eventually die to argue for the conclusion that I am human. Now let's see if it's valid. If it's true that all humans will eventually die, and I'm something that will eventually die, doesn't mean that it has to be the case that I am human. It's actually not, because there are lots of things that will eventually die but aren't human. So all you know about me at this stage by the argument alone is that I'll eventually die. So knowing that all humans will eventually die and knowing that I'll eventually die does not necessarily mean that I am human. You'll also notice that even though both of the premises are true and that the conclusion happens to be true, the argument does not entail the conclusion. So it doesn't mean that it has to be the case that I am human from this argument. So this is an invalid argument. So a good way to show that an argument is invalid is by offering a counterexample. A counterexample is showing a circumstance where even if all the premises are true, the conclusion could turn out to be false. In our previous argument, a counterexample could be I could be an animal or I could be a plant, because they can eventually die as well. So that is a way we can show how an argument is invalid, by providing a counterexample where all the premises may be true, but the conclusion could turn out to be false. So when we had the examples of all humans eventually dying and all vampires being skateboards, you could tell that regardless of what categories you put in place of one another, it was the logical structure of the argument that made it valid. And there's lots of different logical structures out there. Some are valid and some are invalid, which we'll be learning in later tutorials. They've got specific terms and specific ways of doing it. We'll look at the one that we covered in today's video. So what you can do here is whatever categories you are going to put in, you could replace them with just a letter, similar to how we do in algebra with mathematics. And this is called in philosophy logical form. So if you look at the top here, this is the logical form of the argument which was valid. The all humans will eventually die, I am human, therefore I'll eventually die, as such. All A are B, so you could say A represents being a human or being a vampire, and B representing being eventually dying or being a skateboard. And then premise 2 would be A, so that once again representing being human or being a vampire. And then therefore B representing the eventually dying or being a skateboard. So you can see that it doesn't really matter whatever you put in there. It's the logical structure that makes it valid. So it's always valid. So this kind of logical structure here is always valid. So once you start to learn these things, it can be very quick to think of whether an argument's valid or not without having to worry about counterexamples and things like that, or stress too much on the imagination. So you can see here how logical form can be helpful in understanding an argument being valid or invalid almost the second you hear it or almost the second you read it. Looking at the second one, you can tell how arguments can always be invalid. This is the one similar to the all humans will eventually die, I'll eventually die, therefore I'm human, as all A are B, B therefore A. So you can see when you put it in this method, you can see which logical structures are always valid and which logical structures are always invalid. So it can be very helpful to use the method of logical form, which we'll continue to do in later tutorials when we discuss valid forms of arguments and invalid forms of arguments down the track. If you want more information, you can go onto the website www.philosophycriticalthinking.com. Under the valid and invalid section of the tutorials, there's some test questions there if you want to practice that a bit more, because we're starting to get into the more technical side of critical thinking and philosophy. I also recommend the book Understanding Arguments by Walter St. Armstrong and Robert Fogelin, which is in the description if you want to purchase that. Our next video is going to be on sound and unsound arguments. This is the next step in analyzing arguments once we've established whether an argument's valid or invalid. If you want to stay in tune for more tutorials, please subscribe and click the bell. Thanks.